Hello and thanks for joining us on this week's episode of The Bike Show. Don is currently away, stumbling around the mountains of Lesotho, following all the action at this year's Roof of Africa, mother of all hard enduros, but later he will be telling us about his new Scorpion adventure helmet and talking with Hero SA about their latest news. The weather is being kind in Lesotho at the moment, but it's rather chilly here. -7 in fact this morning, and the roads are covered in ice, and so instead of taking a ride to reintroduce my long-term KTM SMT that illness has unfortunately kept me from using this past 6 months, I am taking the coward's way out and will instead be talking about some new models that should be with us early in 2024. Two of which are updated versions of bikes that I rode earlier this year and of which I am already a huge fan. There are currently some basic similarities between the bikes, but there are also some stark differences as well, and yet both have that most important of factors in common. They are massively entertaining, fun. They deliver it in spades, exhilaration, visceral, almost simple pleasures, and yet there's also no shortage of technology here either, though thankfully most of that can be tailored to suit your own personal riding requirements. For those of you who've followed the bike show for any length of time, you've possibly realised I'm talking about some bikes that are sporty and probably naked, and you'd be right. Let me just chuck in another clue and say that the new models come from two countries that speak the same language, and they probably occasionally pass each other on the same mountain passes as well when they head out the factory gates for a day's test riding. The headline grabber is undoubtedly the orange beast from the small Austrian town of Mattighofen, the 1390 Super Duke R. Very nearly 1.4 litres of V-twin with 190 horsepower and 145 Newton meters. This is a bike that could easily Hannibal Lecter you and rip your face off before eating your brain for dessert. And yet, somehow, if it's, and it surely will be, a relatively gentle evolution of the current model, then it will also, somewhat magically, be able to deliver smooth, classy, civilised performance that is rapid yet manageable, fast but not necessarily frenetic, rabid but still reassuring. Not forgetting, of course, that if you poke it with a stick and want it to react accordingly, you'd better grit your teeth and hold on tight. The other country in the region that prate the same tal is, of course, Germany, ignoring for convenience's sake the part of northern Italy that can sprechen the Deutsch. Munich is barely a 2-hour drive from Mattighofen, and while BMW has its own version of what these days is known as a super naked, the models I'm going to be covering are part of its heritage lineup. Retro models have been big business for many years now, and no company is more aware of that fact than BMW. When they debuted the R9T a decade ago in 2014, it was to celebrate 90 years of BMW motorcycle production, hence the nineT in its name. Well, 2024 is just around the corner, and the company will celebrate the more significant number of 100 years of bike building with an updated version of the R9T to be known, somewhat awkwardly, as the R12 nineT. The last 10 years have proven this model to be a huge sales success, for the nineT's recipe of simple, clean, retro aesthetics with a construction that helps facilitate easy customization. Contrary to the original plan that envisaged custom bike builders going to town on the bike, although that obviously still does happen to a certain extent, the big news for the personalisation of this model has been the proliferation of easily swapped bolt-on trinkets, including BMW's own Option 719 range of accessories. From the original R9T, the heritage range soon grew to encompass a scrambler with a 19-inch front wheel, the most basic Pure, the Urban GS and its homage to the original GS of the 1980s, and the Racer S with its nose fairing and classic cafe racer styling. A 10-year run and a 100-year celebration are good enough reasons to update a winning design, but given that success, I wouldn't expect too much rocking of the boat in terms of design, just in case the recipe gets spoiled. Although To show that they're not completely asleep on the job, there is a new addition to the range in the shape of a cruiser based on the R12 nineT called simply the R12, allowing it to slot into the cruiser range alongside its bigger R18 siblings. We'll cover some more of the details of these new BMWs in a moment, but first I want to head back up the road to Mattighoven and take a closer look at KTM's latest incarnation of its legendary beast. As I mentioned, we're talking about a naked sport bike with a monstrous 1350cc displacement, 75-degree V-twin that can generate 190 horsepower and 145 newton meters of torque in a package that weighs 200 kilos before you fill it with 17.5 litres of fuel. This isn't a significant increase over the previous model, but it is nevertheless an increase to a range of numbers that already made the Super Duke R a quite extraordinary sport biking experience. So it undoubtedly remains a beast, but as catchy as that name is, it disguises, as I mentioned earlier, the depths of the talent and sophistication that grace the Super Duke R. Two versions arrive at the same time. The standard Super Duke R, if you can call a €21,500 or about 430,000 rand naked sport bike standard, and the Super Duke R Evo that features WP's third generation adaptive suspension. This extra layer of technology will prize a further €2,000 or about 40,000 rand from your bank account for the pleasure of having the bike read and react to the road conditions on the fly, remove the need for you to twirl any suspension adjusters yourself, and add a MotoGP inspired launch control function that automatically lowers the preload on the rear shock for the ultimate getaway. So OTT for a naked road bike, so very unnecessary, and yet also so very undeniably cool, and par for the course for a brand that unashamedly states that it is in fact ready to race. KTM makes some outrageous bikes, none more so than this beast, and as aggressive as the bikes themselves are, they are accompanied by some equally in-your-face marketing. After the "Hell yeah" tagline of the 890 SMT and a campaign that made fun of its allegedly staid, boring competitors, we now have, well, a slogan that I'm not actually allowed to say on a programme that is broadcast nationally on South African television at times when kids could be watching. No BS is the tagline. It's not the sort of language I'd want my young KTM-obsessed nephews to have blazoned across the walls of their bedrooms on posters, and although it might fit the intended hardcore image of KTM, it does feel like it's trying a bit too hard now. Why not go the whole hog and have the SMT's tagline as yeah? Sometimes it feels to me like they're talking down to KTM fans, like the only way to engage with the riders who love their brilliantly sporty products is to be crude and rude, when their bikes are actually clever and complex. Oh well, my snobby, aged, out-of-touch reaction aside, there's no denying that these two new Super Dukes will be welcomed by fans of the breed, none more so than me. The use of a V-twin is the ace up this model's sleeve. The way that this engine configuration generates its thrust to so perfectly match at least what I expect from a naked sport bike gives it an inherent advantage over its V4 triple or inline-4 rivals. Not that, of course, I would complain if I had to make do with a Street Fighter V4 in my garage. There's a lot more in-depth tech to cover in terms of electronics, some mild chassis tweaks and improved suspension, but that will have to wait until we manage to grab ourselves a first ride. In the meantime, like me, I hope this broad overview has whetted your appetite for one of my most eagerly anticipated new models of 2024. Right, from the juvenile rebellion of a naked KTM, we head back to the mature dominion of a retro BMW. Just like the Boxer engine GS, the similarly powered R9T has become the very epitome of a BMW. So successfully has the model resonated not only with its existing customers, but also generally with fans of the retro movement. As always, The job of updating such a successful model involves a delicate balance between attempting to introduce some genuine improvements into the mix while leaving undisturbed the original traits that so enthused its fans. And you will need to be something of a fan to notice the subtle developments that mark out this new R12 nineT. The engine remains effectively the same 1170cc, 109 horsepower, 115 Newton metre air and oil-cooled boxer unit, albeit with a different exhaust and rocker box covers. If you're nerdy enough, you may also notice that the frame has been changed to allow easier customisation and the rear shock has moved a touch, while the 16-litre aluminium tank has been gently reshaped to make it shorter and help the rider feel more plugged into the front end. You get 3 riding modes, 2 analogue dials and a retail price that should start at just over 18,000 euros or about 365,000 rand. Based on the same set of ingredients but coming in about 60 grand cheaper is the all-new R12, the baby of the cruiser range. The motor is the same as the R12 nineTs to all intents and purposes, though it plays a different 95 horsepower tune with 5 Newton meters less peak torque. Instead of 3 riding modes, it makes do with 2, and although the chassis is nearly identical as well, the fork has been kicked out to give a more relaxed rake. There's less suspension travel and the wheel sizes are changed from the R12 nineT's 17 inches at both ends to a 19 at the front and a 16-incher on the rear of the cruiser. Completing the more obvious visual changes are the smaller 14-litre fuel tank, reshaped mudguards and a higher handlebar. It is by no means a shouty type of new model, but the R12 Cruiser could be the sleeper addition to the range that helps bring new riders into the BMW fold, especially in the North American market. Some of my most enjoyable riding experiences this year were on some fabulous mountain roads in France on the Super Duke R Evo and in Spain on the R9T during a cold winter, and yet both dealt with the challenging conditions with ease, allowing me to revel in the sporting credentials of 2 models that might sit at opposite ends of the power spectrum but can both exhilarate courtesy of handling abilities that only ever encourage and reassure. I'm convinced these 2 new updated versions will only offer more of the same, and that mouth-watering proposition makes me impatient for the new year to arrive as quickly as possible. See you after this short break with news from Hero.